Welcome back, and in this last video we're going to do just two examples, one together and one on your own, to just kind of summarize everything that we've been doing here in this fourth step of the scientific method under the perspective of statistics. Okay, so we're going to focus on that interpretation piece and conclusion. So, context here, average amount of time caffeine stays in a human body after absorption is 5 hours. You believe it's actually less. We've seen this hypothesis test come up before. So here is the hypothesis test. And then now this next piece is new. So we suppose we got a sample. It had a mean of that after conducting a t-test, which was appropriate. We found the p-value to be that. And now we want to state the conclusion in context. So you might need to review some things, but if we go back to, this one, when we make a decision, we need to make sure to do all this. So say the decision in context, dependence on data, okay, and all that. So here we go, okay. First of all, I just want to think about what is the decision, okay. Okay, so P is 0.34, and if I use an alpha, that is 5%, which is typical. You can actually specify it, but by default, assume that it's 5%. But when I compare these two, P is bigger than alpha, so this means that I'm going to fail to reject the null hypothesis. Okay, so here is the conclusion. It is in paragraph form. It is a lot. Okay. It was found that the mean, x bar, we'll learn about this later, but x bar is the mean. I'll maybe just say the sample mean was 4.8 and the p-value was 0.34. Okay, now this next part is fairly boilerplate and should be included in most of your interpretations. Okay, the data suggests, oh, I'm sorry. Actually, since P is bigger than alpha at 0.05, we fail to reject the null hypothesis. Okay. Okay, so that sentence or a variation thereof should appear in most of your interpretations. Okay. Now the next sentence too is fairly standard. The data suggests that there is insufficient evidence, okay, and I'll dissect this in just a moment, insufficient evidence that the average time that caffeine stays, in the body is less than 5 hours. Okay, let me dissect this. Okay, so the data suggests here that language, that's indicating our dependence on data. Okay, so we should do that. But what is the structure that we are using here? So we introduce that phrase, and then we say that there's insufficient evidence that. Okay, so this piece here is that piece where, nope, here. that we're saying that there's either sufficient or insufficient evidence for the alternate hypothesis. Okay, so here, since I failed to reject the null, okay, I'm favoring the null, meaning I cannot go further with the alternative hypothesis. Okay, and then, so this is effectively the fail to reject in context. And then what follows it, that the average time of caffeine stays in the body is less than all that, that's your alternative hypothesis. Okay, so the structure of this sentence really is the data suggests that, and then either sufficient or insufficient evidence, depending on, what your decision was, and then your alternative hypothesis. Okay, that'll be effectively the structure for that sentence. Okay, and then lastly, now we would state any possible errors that we could make. Since we failed to reject the null, a type 2 error could have been made. Where we believe that caffeine stays in the body for 5 hours when it is actually less. Okay, so this is where we are acknowledging that we are saying this is we believe that it's more, or we're favoring the null hypothesis, I should say, and then acknowledging in reality it's actually the alternative hypothesis. Okay, and I need to state a consequence. A consequence of this is that people may not consume caffeine as frequently as needed. Okay, so for example, if it is, if the mean time is actually like 4.5 hours, they maybe need another dose of caffeine after 4.5 hours, as compared to 5 hours. So there's like a half-hour gap where they're uncaffeinated, God forbid. Okay, so anyway, just to kind of review the structure here, we first discuss the statistics and the p-value that we found. Okay, so we sample mean and that, and then we state our decision. Okay, so state the statistics, state the decision, and then the third sentence is the interpretation piece, which is a little tricky. So we indicate dependence on data, and then talk about either insufficient or sufficient evidence for the alternative hypothesis. And then lastly, we acknowledge that some statistical error could have occurred. Okay, so the last example is for you to do. Okay, I will provide the solution, or at least my solution, and you are welcome to review it at the end of this video. Okay, so when we think about male and female newborns, okay, it's equally likely that you could have a male or female for a newborn child, okay, or a baby, okay. So the test that we're looking at is set up so that the null hypothesis is the proportion of male newborns is 0.5, the proportion of female newborns is 0.5, and then we're saying the alternative hypothesis is that's not the case, okay. And so we got a sample, it said the proportion of male newborns is 0.46, proportion of females thus is 0.54, and then when we did the appropriate test, we got the p-value to be 0.03. I didn't say which test we were doing. That's something for you to think about on the side. But then we want to state the conclusion in context and then talk about the error. Okay, so feel free to pause the video, try this on your own, and resume the video when you're ready to see my solution. And here's my answer. So I started out with stating the summary statistics and the p-value. I made a decision of rejecting the null hypothesis. And then I said the data suggests that, okay, there is sufficient evidence, because I rejected the null, that, and then the alternative hypothesis. And lastly, I said because I rejected the null hypothesis when it was actually true, that could have been a type 1 error. And then I said, well, the consequence of this is that people might try to have more male babies or more of one sex baby than the other when they really shouldn't. Okay, so this is a lot of writing, yep, and I'm there with you, but it is necessary. So we'll get more practice in this in class, but if you have any questions, bring them to class.